Item 1-2, Senate Paper 465, joint resolution memorializing the United States Congress and
Representative from Jay, Representative Gilbert, moves that the further reading of this joint resolution be dispensed with. Is this the pleasure of the House? It's a vote. Is it now the pleasure of the House that this joint resolution be adopted in concurrence? It's a vote.
Today we have the exciting news that the Maine House of Representatives passed by acclamation, this is unanimous support, for a memorial resolution calling upon the U.S. Congress to enact Marcy Kaptur's bill, H.R. 129, to reinstate Glass-Steagall. This followed a similar vote by acclamation in the Maine Senate on Thursday. So this is the second House of Representatives, State House of Representatives, which has passed a resolution like this. It's the first, which is, again, a unanimous vote, although South Dakota, came quite close. I think there were only 2 people who were in opposition to that resolution. So it's very, very exciting news. Just to give you a bit of a sense of the process which caused this to occur, which I was involved in to some extent, I do want to start by saying that one element of this kind of process, which is always critical, is somebody deciding to take individual leadership. And that absolutely was the case in Maine with this resolution. Senator John Patrick decided to take up this cause of for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, and that was a critical part of this process. His decision to take personal leadership. After that, when we actually had a resolution, one of the first things which we needed to do was to get support for this resolution in the Legislative Council, which is some state houses function like this. It's a smaller body of legislators, Senate and House, who sort of decide which resolutions are going to go through and which aren't. So initially we faced the challenge, which we succeeded in contacting some of these senators and representatives on the Legislative Council and getting bipartisan support, because the Legislative Council it's a bipartisan body, and organizing Democrats and Republicans around the idea that this is really something critical, the need to reinstate Glass-Steagall. And we succeeded in doing that. It went through the Legislative Council. Then we faced, the more daunting challenge of organizing the entire Maine Senate and House, which is very large. The Senate has 30 members. The Maine House of Representatives has 151 members. And I think it's interesting that we ended up, directly speaking with or contacting in some way about a third of this body, a third of the 151 members of the House. Overall, there ended up being between the Senate and the House about 30 co-sponsors. And I think it's very interesting that on the one hand, some of these people were people who we were directly contacting and organizing about supporting this resolution, supporting the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. But in many of the cases, these are people that we didn't speak to directly. So an aspect of the process in Maine, which I think is interesting and actually ideal, is when the organizing process it sort of takes on a life of its own to a certain extent, where we actually can't account for everybody who chose to co-sponsor this bill. And I think that's actually an ideal situation. We also, in Maine, in terms of, for example, the composition of the co-sponsors, this was not only bipartisan. Among the co-sponsors, you actually had 5 parties represented. You had Democrat, Republican, Independent, Undeclared, and one of the most ardent supporters that we spoke to, representative who represents one of the Maine Indian tribes, the Holton Band of Maliseets. So it was more than even just bipartisan. I can say from some of the discussions that I had with some of these representatives, it was not often the case that people immediately recognized Glass-Steagall when you brought it up to them. But in many cases, it was the case that people were, as you started to describe what Glass-Steagall was, what it had done, people remembered people had a memory of this. In one case, one woman told me, oh my goodness, she said, you know what, I remember driving in my car in the 90s, in the late 90s, 1999, I guess, when they announced the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And I remember thinking to myself, what a terrible mistake that was. And this was the character of a lot of the discussions that I had with some of these representatives, where they sort of, once you started to describe it, people remembered this, and people thought to themselves, this might have been really where things went wrong, and this is something that we should remedy. This sort of memory of this terrible mistake, which was the repeal of Glass-Steagall. You know, we had another case of one of the representatives who was actually referred to himself as sort of a scholar, had specialized in studying 1930s financial law. He was actually the co-sponsor in the House, and he said, really, the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, were this to occur and were he to be involved in this, would be one of the most important things that he could be involved in his life. So this is sort of just to give you a bit of a taste of the process there. I can also say, to the extent that other people were getting involved in this, some of our activists, for example, in Maine, you know, have a case of somebody who lives in one of the islands in Casco Bay who wrote to her representative, who became a co-sponsor of the bill. Another interesting case is an individual who was very active in the Tea Party before the 2012 election, and, you know, of course, after the election became completely, and before the election became completely frustrated with the Tea Party as an organization and its, you know, real lack of mission, you know, what he referred to as just being totally focused on complaining but not taking action. And this individual just became completely excited about the idea that Glass-Steagall was a cause to take up. If, for example, the Tea Party was going to have any mission that was really worth anything, it was this. It was to get the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. This is somebody who I spoke to a couple times, who was going on the LaRouche PAC website, printing up some of the various leaflets that we have on Glass-Steagall, setting up meetings for himself, you know, and trying to organize his friends and fellow Tea Partiers around the fact that you know, this is really the only thing worth fighting for at this point. The other thing I can say is, as soon as the Maine Senate passed the resolution on Thursday, Senator Patrick immediately issued a press release. And if I could, I'd like to read from this. It's actually very good. On the one hand, in his own words, describes the necessity for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall and what caused him to introduce this resolution. And so this is from Senator John Patrick. He said, for 70 years, Glass-Steagall prevented the kind of financial catastrophe we experienced in 2008. Without Glass-Steagall, we lost an important economic stabilizer and any semblance of control and oversight we had over these mega banks. Left to their own devices, these banks were able to engage in spectacularly risky behavior that eventually brought down the entire global economy. I am all for the free market, but sometimes you need a referee. Glass-Steagall is that referee. Then, very importantly, Senator Patrick draws attention to the fact that in the U.S. House of Representatives, both of the congresspeople from Maine, Mike Michaud and Shelley Pingree, are both co-sponsors, active, you know, supporters of Glass-Steagall. They're co-sponsors of Marcy Kaptur's bill, H.R. 129. He also importantly refers to the fact that U.S. Senator Angus King has expressed support for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. Now, this is not a unique case. Angus King is one among a handful of new freshman senators who, on the campaign trail, were very vocal about their support for the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall, but have been much less vocal since actually becoming members of the U.S. Senate. So it's very important that Senator Patrick draws attention to this in his press release, and I think it's also another aspect of why this resolution coming from Maine is really important.